Hi, this is Steve Graves from California State University at Northridge, here in ever quiet and peaceful Hollywood, giving you a virtual field trip of the Redline districts from Hollywood down to the Wilshire district. So what we're going to take a look at is the built landscape associated with these various zoned areas mapped by the Homeowners Loan Corporation of America. So let's go ahead and get started. Since it's a field trip, I don't want to bore you too much with background or PowerPoint slides, but I think that a slight bit of this background is in order to bring you up to speed in case you don't really know what redlining is. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was the agency responsible for creating these redlined maps. But it wasn't just redlining, as you can see in this image. It's also, there was green lining and blue lining and yellow lining, but we don't really hear about those because they were not, or have not been considered to be particularly onerous to the residents who live there. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was started in '33 as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The idea was that if the government would guarantee loans, particularly ones that were in trouble, that banks and home loan corporations would be more likely to do these things. And the initial success of this organization or this program seems to be one of reasonably acceptable rates of home loans being issued to people and of all walks of life. The thing that the Homeowners Loan Corporation is famous for is that in 1935 they began creating these maps. I believe that some of it was farmed out to another company. And the field operatives who were out there mapping would estimate the risk basically in every neighborhood by putting markers on the map and describing the neighborhood. Neighborhoods with the highest default potential were mapped in red or redlined, as you can see here on this map. The areas with lower risk were marked in subsequently, I guess, better colors. The yellow was moderate risk, and then green and blue were progressively lower risk. So the blue neighborhoods presented virtually no risk at all in the minds of these field operatives that were making the maps. Well, there's a couple of big problems. One is that individuals were, their credit worthiness was being measured by the group that they lived with. And some of these things, as you can see, references the quality of the housing in the neighborhood. And that perhaps is acceptable in one way. But the other really disturbing part is the overtly racist and really hostile language that seems to have been extremely important in the grading of the neighborhoods into these various categories. And so this is a red-lined neighborhood, and it includes, as you see here, subversive racial and social element. Japanese and Filipinos were apparently living in this area just south of Hollywood Boulevard at that time. And you see that apparently Mexicans were problematic as well. And they said, well, if it's not so bad here in the last sentence, that the scattering of the Japanese and Filipino residents, this section would be entitled to a higher grade. The area as a whole is assigned a medial red grade. And so that is the area that we will take a look at first, but should point out that the HOLC maps, clearly a violation of the people's, the rights of people who lived in these neighborhoods, not only the people of color that lived in these neighborhoods, but everybody that lived in these neighborhoods. And it was also, I think Jewish people were considered a risk as well. And there are loads and loads and loads of studies linking the redlining to a host of environmental, economic, social ills.
But how much blame these maps deserve, I think, is less clear. And it's easy to assign the blame to the maps, but I think a closer inspection or a better analysis would find that this legacy is mixed. Clearly, there were discriminatory housing practices in place, long established by a host of actors and other agencies before the HOLC came along and mapped and essentially encoded the results of previous generations. So with or without these maps, these neighborhoods were in many ways already redlined. The great criticism is that the redlining maps encoded this discrimination at the federal level, and that it sort of locked these neighborhoods into their respective categorizations. And so the redline neighborhoods, it made it more difficult to get a home loan to improve the quality of the house, or to sell the house to somebody else because, well, new buyers would need a mortgage loan in order to move in, and it's a redline neighborhood. So the notion is that it sort of locked these neighborhoods into a long-term sort of snapshot of where they were in 1935. I would argue that that may be true, but lenders, realtors, and other residents there was a host of other means to practice housing discrimination, and many of them are evident on the landscape, even in those areas that were not redlined. Those of you who know LA well, or even have just seen it on television, probably know of the Crenshaw District. It's a large African American area that has clearly suffered from a great deal of discriminatory practices, yet it basically didn't exist in the HOLC time during the New Deal. And so even on this map here, you can see that it's not redlined or yellow lined or blue lined or anything, because none of that existed. So there were many other tools to discriminate, and the redlining it should not be considered a single variable cause of housing discrimination. A counter argument has been made by one economist, at least, that found that the HOLC itself did a pretty good job of lending equitably, and that African Americans were as likely to secure a home loan through the HOLC as any other ethnic group, sort of based on percentages of loans and percentage of persons applying. So once again, things to us academics are always more complicated than they might seem. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in the car and we're going to drive through several of these neighborhoods south of Hollywood Boulevard. We're going to first drive through a redline neighborhood, then a bit of a yellow neighborhood, a green neighborhood, a blue neighborhood, and I will try to narrate. What's interesting is to see how some of these neighborhoods have been locked in and what the landscape elements tell about the legacy of the HOLC today. And I have my students see if they can find the transition zones. What street did they cross when the neighborhood changed? And did that correspond to the HOLC neighborhood boundary? So let's go take a look at that. So here we are riding through a redlined neighborhood, and I would have the students take a look at the size of the yard, or the lack thereof, the quality of the sidewalks, the amount of dog poop on the sidewalks, the presence of fences, the presence of graffiti, and generally the sort of the size of the house, lawn, and the amount of the care of the bars on the windows, and the type of cars. They developed their own protocol for defining these neighborhoods through a visual inspection. Some of the cars aren't half bad in the neighborhood. Whoop. There's a Prius. There's a mixture of single-family homes here and a Tesla, and a number of things that have either been knocked down and replaced by multifamily dwellings, or perhaps were always multifamily. And so now we're in a yellow zone neighborhood. You notice that there is also some multifamily dwellings here. There's still a few bars on the windows. The yards tend to be a little better maintained. And there is some evidence of gentrification here as well, in terms of the tear down houses, where these property buyers come in and knock down these perfectly fine single family housing and replace them with a much larger house. Probably should be noted that all of these houses are probably in the multi-million-dollar range already. So now we've entered a green neighborhood, and the green lined areas have slightly larger yards, slightly fewer cracks in the sidewalks, a greater mix of two-story houses in with the occasional one-story affair. My students generally notice that there's more xeriscaping in the lawns at this point, and that there's hardly any dog feces on the street. Green neighborhoods were a little rarer. And finally, we come to the blue neighborhoods. And as you can see already, these are mansions with expansive front lawns, expansive backyards that we don't really get to see. A lot fewer cars on the street, impeccably manicured yards. A lot of the cars you do see on the street are, as we see here, trucks of work crews that are at the house, and also we have a tendency to see what I think are the cars from the housekeepers and whatnot. Some of the nicer automobiles are parked in the backyards where they had rear garages, or perhaps a kind of carriage house situation. So there you have it. That's a Redline tour of Los Angeles from Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard down towards Larchmont Village. And you can see that redlining has made a difference. If you want to find redlining maps for your hometown, go here to this website. I'll put a link, and you can zoom in on the neighborhood and find all of the details about each of the areas that were redlined back in the 1930s, and you can do your own tour. So I hope you enjoyed this. For the California Geographical Society and geographyplanet.org, I'm signing off.